S is for Sauron, said Gimli. That is easy to read. Nay, said Legolas. Sauron does not use the elf runes. Neither does he use his right name, nor permit it to be spelt or spoken, said Aragorn. And he does not use white. The orcs in the service of Barad-dûr use the sign of the red eye. Hey everyone, Yoyston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we are going to be taking a look at how Peter Jackson's movies changed the character of Sauron from the books, and why he made him a flaming eye. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. To start, the translation of the character of Sauron from books to films was, in some ways, quite different than how other characters such as Faramir or Aragorn were translated from book to movie, as I've covered recently. In the lore of Tolkien, Sauron, while a powerful and ever-lurking figure in the shadows of Mordor in the east, whose clouds of darkness ever threatened to swallow the west, was still very much a background presence more than an ever-actively present domineering force. Of course, Sauron and his servants are the main threats to Middle-earth throughout The Lord of the Rings, and failing to stop them would mean the dominion of Sauron and the end of the Free Peoples, absolutely. But even this description of the threat is so large-scale, and Sauron has many powerful servants that carry out his will that, even in the book, we never really see Sauron in any particular scene. Not at least during the main events of The Lord of the Rings in the late Third Age. But again, we are aware of his presence lurking in the greater background of the story. My point is that Sauron, throughout the story, is much more of a presence than an active force. He's a figure that is far more elusive and difficult to defeat, more so than other villains in other stories. And while in the process of creating the films, Peter Jackson almost greatly changed this, as he quite nearly added a scene of Sauron fighting Aragorn at the Battle of the Black Gate. Peter Jackson actually kept this aspect of Sauron from the books mostly intact, but he did change it a little bit. Sauron is less of just a physical form in the movies, as he takes on his symbol and image from the books as his physical presence on screen. The films ran with the imagery of the red eye of Sauron in the books and took it further, making Sauron a literal flaming eye atop his Tower of Barad-dûr in the films, giving the audience something to see and visualize as the form of the great evil our heroes are fighting against. In the book, Sauron does actually have a physical but weak form, and he hides himself away in the Tower of Barad-dûr, for if that body would be destroyed, it would set his plans back indefinitely, but not permanently, as long as the One Ring still existed. But the imagery of the Eye of Sauron is present in many places in the book, from Frodo contending with the Eye atop a Munhen, to the three hunters investigating those who were slain by Boromir, to the implements of the orcs and so forth. But it is never stated that Sauron is literally a flaming eye atop Barad-dûr in the books. Yet, this is actually a really interesting misconception about the books that came from the movies, because, in my mind, this change was actually rather well done in the process of adapting books to movies, and generally people have agreed with it so much that they believed that's how it was in the books. Perhaps Sauron did have some sort of physical manifestation in the movies during the War of the Ring, as indicated in the scene where Aragorn looks into the Palantir and sees the same version of Sauron that we saw in the flashback to the War of the Last Alliance at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, raising up a Palantir himself. But whereas we cannot be sure about that, we can at least be sure that he is physically manifested. At least the physical imagery of Sauron is the flaming eye atop his tower, and he is mostly represented thusly throughout all of the films. This change, which is strangely both major and minor concerning the character of Sauron from books to films, was, again in my mind, well done for the movies, I think, as it fulfills the show don't tell rule of movie making without overtly changing the presence of Sauron in the story. Yet I also think that with the world that Tolkien set up in the books, this would not have quite worked in the books without more explanation. Every time I watch the movies, I do wonder where this magical eye comes from, or if it is the manifestation that Sauron has conjured with his spirit and keeps alight somehow, or even if it is the manifestation of him using the Palantir to look for the ring. Either way, this change at least establishes the presence of Sauron in Mordor a bit more actively in the film than having him hidden away in his tower, but never seen by the camera. But in the books, having this powerful and great dark and evil figure sitting atop some throne somewhere in Barad-dûr gives Sauron this more mysterious and interesting presence in the shadow and the darkness of Mordor, especially when Frodo and Sam are really nearby, and Sauron could have come forth at any time, and perhaps almost did before the destruction of the ring. It creeps me out to visualize how a confrontation between our hobbits and the physical manifestation of the Dark Lord, even in his weak form, would have gone in the books. But in the movies, it is very visually interesting to see the eye just looking for them across Mordor, and it adds more drama and tension to scenes visually where such things were not as necessary in the books. I have really contemplated the Eye of Sauron change over the years, and have pondered if it was necessary or over the top at all, or if they should have just put Sauron on the battlefield at the Black Gate, like Peter Jackson was contemplating doing. And while my opinion is certainly subject to change, especially after I read your comments about all of this, please leave them below. And again, it is just that my opinion, I do think I've landed on my answer about all of these questions. The Flaming Eye of Sauron, in my opinion, works for the movies. When I think of Mordor in the movies, I think of 2, maybe 3 things immediately. Mount Doom, the Eye of Sauron atop Barad-dûr, and maybe the Black Gate. Sauron as an individual is such a defensive player, never leaving his tower in either book nor movie in the main events. So it makes sense that in the visual representation of Mordor in the movie, he is the dominating tyrant, the flaming eye keeping watch over his land, and ever looking for the ring, ever keeping watch over his servants that they may never rest. Again, the imagery and symbolism of the eye is very fascinating to deconstruct. There is so much good symbolism and imagery at play there, which speaks volumes of the film's version of the character. It just works so well for the movies, especially towards the end, during the Battle of the Black Gate, where the eye is looking at Aragorn and Aragorn at the eye, and Aragorn does it all for Frodo, despite the power of the Dark Lord being so singularly focused on him alone. I like this change, and this leads me to the other part. I also like the fact that Peter Jackson did not put a physical form of Sauron at the Battle of the Black Gate. While it is a really cool idea, I tend to agree with what Peter Jackson said in the end, that he was worried it would take too much of the attention and focus away from the main plot of Frodo and the Ring, and perhaps the audience would be confused, thinking it equally or more important that Aragorn beats Sauron in physical combat than Frodo destroying the ring, or that Frodo needed to destroy the ring solely to save Aragorn, being too caught up in the moment, rather than the larger plot of Sauron versus the free peoples of Middle-earth and the destruction of the ring being the gateway to peace and freedom. And obviously the book didn't need that moment, and neither did the movie. So overall, I must say that I think how the movies changed the character of Sauron was quite well done. It places more emphasis on the imagery and symbolism of Sauron, and makes it more of a visual representation. Barad-dûr in some ways seems more important in the movies than in the books, as the union of the 2 towers in that movie is between Barad-dûr and Orthanc, whereas in the books it is Minas Morgul and Orthanc. So again, this eye atop Barad-dûr actually places more emphasis on that part of Mordor as well. Now, I know that the flaming eye of Sauron in the movies might be too much for some, as it loses the subtlety of Sauron's presence that we get more of in the books, and even for some it might take away the fear that one could feel around Sauron. But the presence of the eye is more or less just the physical manifestation that we see him as, and I think it was worth it. But I am also glad that Sauron kept the overall presence and theme that he had in the books. Other than this, though, Sauron's character was not too greatly changed from the books to the films, but I should say that he was perhaps a bit more complex overall in the books, as he thought more strategically during the war about multiple attacks and battles at once, like when he sent attacks from Dol Guldur to Lothlorien in the north, while he was attacking Gondor in the south, or the strife between he and Saruman playing a bigger role in the books. While these changes are worth mentioning and would have been interesting elements of Sauron to see more of in the movies, I understand that the focus needed to remain on Frodo and the Ring, to not make the movies any longer or more complex than they already are. But my friends, let me know your thoughts on how the films changed Sauron, particularly how he was translated into the flaming eye atop Barad-dûr in the movies. What do you think about these changes, and is there anything I left out or forgot about? Let me know. And so we come to the end of our tale on how the films changed Sauron. From this tale, my biggest takeaway is that there is a level of subtlety and imagery that can be just as powerful, or even more powerful, than any physical form. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this video on how the films changed Sauron. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts on these changes? Let me know in the comments below. Again, at this point, I really like this major change. The Eye of Sauron is yet another association that I have with the film's version of Middle-earth, and it brings me back to being a kid and seeing that image when loading up something like Battle of Middle-earth or watching the movies, of course. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles from our friends Mythologie Candles, or order some Weta or United Cutlery Lord of the Rings swords, statues, and other replicas from Castle Kon, who does international shipping, and use the code WEST at checkout. And please check out our merch and Patreon. Thanks to our Valor Tier patrons and YouTube members, Peter Shepard, Jonathan Putin, Mark Kralik, Blair Scouten, Merton, Molly Sullivan, John Hume, Sam McBee, Matt Sabach, Elizabeth Calvert, Maz Gibbs, Reese Jenkins, Adam Petrolik, Anthony Harmon, Dorwin Gray, Arthur Merlin, Dale Davis, Kingswild Project, and Robert Bogue. Thank you so much to all of our patrons and YouTube members. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today. And I'll see you all again next Sunday with a video on the Old Forest, the home of Tom Bombadil. You all are the best, my friends. Thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.